lot of information and content coming in. So for those who I have not yet met, my name is Monica. I am the co-founder and the executive director of Live Like Goose Grief and Trauma Recovery. And I am completing my dissertation and my PhD in complex childhood trauma. My adult career has been focused on youth, starting with being an educator and a high school teacher, and then coming back around on how we can actually support the youth and the kids in a different way. And to give you a little bit lay of the land, before I even start, because y'all have been through a lot of information, what I would like you to do, invite you to do, if it feels right, is just to take a breath. And just notice. Notice what you're aware of. You might notice tightness. You might have thoughts that are going 10,000 miles a minute. Ideas you want to start implementing. You might even feel even emotions in there. It's just noticing. And so a lot of how this workshop's going to be is twofold. Is that the first half is talking a little bit about trauma so you can understand it. Everywhere from how it might present, as well as what is actually happening within their youth. And then the second half, we're going to move into what we can do, and what we can actually start implementing into our centers and our programs, and to really support them. The other thing is that the way I teach is twofold. It's not all content driven. It's also a little bit experiential. And what I like to do is I like to model the way we are with our youth. And so a lot of it is what we just did, is just taking a pause. And just taking a pause in a moment, just to do a check-in, helps us start to, like, oh wait, how am I doing? And the more we do that for ourselves, the more we can do that with the youth that we're doing, right? Because a lot of what's happening is they're not even aware of what's going on. I'll get into more of it later, but a lot of their emotions, a lot of their thoughts, they've disconnected from it so much just to survive. And so they don't even know what's coming out. It comes out in behaviors, it comes out in the way they talk or they don't talk. And just the mere pause stops the monkey brain from continuing to go on. Just to get a quick assessment, anyone here have experience in trauma-informed, like training, education? Raise a hand if you have had any experience or any. Okay. And those that this is new completely to what trauma-informed, what trauma is. Okay. So moving on into what is trauma. When I work with kids and I work with youth, before we can do anything differently, we need to know where we are. We need to know we can't fix or change anything if we don't even know what's going on. And so just a quick, a couple statistics that I wanted just to share with you, which you might already be experiencing with the youth that you're working with and in the population, but just to really understand where the crisis, it is a crisis that our youth is going through right now. In the last decade, there has been huge spikes in depression. It has risen 52 to 63% in our youth, as well as psychological distress, which trauma falls under the distress and the tension, has increased 71%, as well as suicidal thoughts or actions has increased 47%. And just looking at these numbers is like, this is where our population is. And this is what's happening and what they're dealing with on a day-to-day. Regardless of trying to go to school, regardless of trying to survive and make sure they eat and make sure they can relate to other kids, this is what's going on underneath everything. And even thinking about them going to schools and going to their centers, that they're trying, I've seen the students actually start to console each other, that it's so intense. And then the other reality I wanted to point out is that more than 2/3 of children report at least one traumatic event by the age of 16. And the next slide I'll go into, like what trauma is, what these events might be, and what they're experiencing. Before I move forward, is there any questions as we move on? At any time, throw a hand up. The teacher and me likes to make sure that everyone's together as a group. So, what is trauma? The general definition of looking what trauma is that the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, they define it as events or circumstances that are experienced as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. So they feel that their survival is being threatened. And so because of that, it has a long-lasting effect on them. And when you think of survival, it's the fight or flight. Something is happening where they're not getting enough food, where there is a divorce happening in their family, and their whole survival mechanism kicks in. And so the animal in us is going to be either ready to run and get out of there, or it's going to be ready to fight. The other one, the last one, is like the freeze, which is the dead possum. So kids who you might see are like despondent, that are there but not there, there might be undercurrents of trauma as well. And so I have examples of different experiences that our youth might be experiencing, which are traumatic events. And one thing that I do want to note before I highlight some of these is that two kids can experience the exact same thing, and they might have completely different responses. One might actually go into trauma response, and the other one, it doesn't actually impact them, it doesn't affect. I'll talk about why the differences might be there, but it's just important to note. So looking at these different things of how it really affects our youth is divorce. Their sense of safety, their sense of home is breaking apart. And so them having to figure out who they are, as well as not being pulled into, do they identify this parent or that parent, becomes a struggle inside them. So that could be shocking to them. Bullying is another one, constantly where they're being oppressed or bullied or made fun of because who they are is not okay, and they're constantly experience that oppression every single day. That puts them into survival. What do they need to do in order to reorient themselves to able to just survive the school day, survive the community that they're in? Domestic violence is important, I'll come back to as well. So they have parents who are either struggling with their own mental health or struggling with their own addictions or even incarceration. And even though the child is not directly experiencing it, but being in that environment is going to impact their sense of safety, if it's okay to actually be. Death of a loved one, and then you get actual abuse, which is physical, emotional, and even psychological, can be really torturous because sometimes you'll see a lot of deception with the kids struggling speaking what is true and what's real and what's not. And a lot of that is because of what their environment is, what they're coming out of. Sexual abuse, and then the last one I really do want to talk about is poverty. Because I know a lot of the populations that we're supporting is lower income, and they're struggling with just the basic, like, do I have a meal on my table? Am I going to have enough to eat? How can I just get through the day? That actually affects not only their sense of well-being, but being able to have enough nutrition to have their brain functioning and develop properly. It really impacts them. So experiencing all these different things, it affects how a child is developing, because they're still developing. Honestly, their brain continues to develop until they're 25 years old. And so when you're working with the kids and you're working with youth and they're trying to make a sense of different things, all this impacts how they develop relationships. Healthy identification, healthy being able to identify what their emotions are. This is all impacting that. So just a general, overall, because the next slide I'll go into a little deeper, is different symptoms of trauma. So this first one is any of those previous experiences. It can impact their performance, their ability to learn, their ability to develop relationships, their emotional regulation, and it causes physical and emotional distress. And the metaphor that I really like using is that somebody in a trauma response is like someone floundering in the ocean, and they're just trying to survive. and they're just trying to like keep their head above water. And so if you can picture a child or a youth in the ocean floundering just to stay alive, and then trying to teach them something, you're trying to teach them about math or English or literature, there is no cognitive processing happening. And so before you can even get to the deeper actual trying to teach them about relationships and healthy communication, we need to get them back on land. And so the second half, we're going to talk about what we can start to do to help get them on the beach, and so they're not floundering anymore. And so going deeper is that if they continually have in this trauma response, and they've got no cognitive processing, they can't really think, then you're going to actually see them start to act out. And so acting out could be truancy. They're not showing up to school. They're not showing up to sports. They're not showing up to classes. And so this is how it's manifesting, is they can't show up. And so they're just going to avoid. They're going to avoid being around people. They're going to avoid taking responsibility for themselves or to being around even adults. Another way is violent behavior. So violent and acting out, is that because they don't know their emotions, they don't know what's going on inside, so it's going to have to come out some way. And so you'll see that with risky behavior, with drug use, with either shoplifting or other deception or actual destruction of property, because they have so much emotions inside and it has to come out, and that's how it does. One other thing to also think about is when you're dealing with a child or somebody who has trauma in their background, is unconsciously they're going to continue repeating the environment or the dynamic that they've come from. Unconsciously they'll be doing it because that's what they know and that's what's familiar. And so again, the first thing is just awareness. What's actually going on? What's actually happening underneath these symptoms that are manifesting. The other two, which is the opposite, is attention seeking. You might have some students who are really clean, that really want to know they're doing a good job, that really want your attention, that they're the first one in line, or they're doing everything perfectly right because they may not receive the connection and a healthy recognition, acknowledgement at home or wherever else. So they're gonna try and seek it out at the centers. And then the other one is isolation. This one's connected to the avoidance and not wanting to talk about it. And so they'll go into being really, really quiet. One thing I found really interesting, I was talking to the founder of one of the King's Gym up in Oakland. And what she was noticing in the youth that they've been working with is they're dealing with not just violence, but deaths of friends or classmates, and there's absolutely no response. There's no affect. And they've become so disconnected from what's happening because they're not even aware that there's something there. And then the last piece I did want to talk about here is that the recognition that this not only impacts the individual children, but it's a domino effect, right? We are a community. So it's going to affect the students around them. It's going to affect their parents. It's going to affect the people that are working with them. So everybody here is touched by what's going on. I'm going to talk in a further slide about vicarious trauma, but it touches everybody within the system. And so my position and our position in education is that it really is systemic change. It's like we as Live Like Goose, as our foundation, works directly with the youth. We also help to educate the staff and the teachers and the facilitators that are all working with it, because the more we can become a healthy ecosystem, we help each other together. Any questions so far? Take a nice, gentle breath. Okay. I am not going to go into all of these. However, just visually, you can see how trauma really ripples and the spider web really grows and it impacts a child who's developing. There are two areas that I definitely want to focus on, is behavior and emotions. Also, if you're interested and you would like a copy of the slideshow, I can take down emails and I'll shoot you the information so you can have access to the details as well. So, the impact of childhood trauma. One thing realizing how this really impacts a child who's developing, because when you have someone who is still young, they are developing their sense of self and who they are, as well as who they are in relationship to others. And the challenge is that wherever they're experiencing this, whether they're watching stuff on the news, which scares a lot of the kids. I know that some of the schools that we were working at, that they've started doing shooter drills. And the shooter drills alone, and even though it's just a drill, it's triggered the students. And some of them we've had to sit with and just be there with them while they have emotions, because they're so scared that might be even a potential happening. And so, in looking at behavior, is you have poor self-regulation. They might be socially withdrawing. People who they used to be friends with, you notice them hanging out less and less and less with other kids around them. It might be an indicator that there's something else going on underneath. They might become aggressive. Aggressive physically, aggressive in their words. They might become antagonistic. Poor impulse control is a big one. We work with a couple of the schools as alternatives to detention programs. And part of what we're teaching them is just to notice their own impulse. Is like with their own self-awareness of noticing their actions that they're doing, what happens right before it. Like there's certain like body cues that'll happen, that'll position, and like, oh wait, something's happening. And so helping them learn how to regulate is a huge part of working with the youth that we have. Risk-taking, which I mentioned, in illegal activity. Sexually acting out, they might be having multiple partners, they might be moving around, they might be unsafe. Anything that puts them in jeopardy is all kind of symptoms that are indicators that there's something going on underneath. Then drug and alcohol misuse is the other one that I mentioned. And then the other side that I didn't want to talk about is emotions. And so this one I feel is really important because, like I was saying, like youth in general, they don't know how to identify their emotions. They don't know what they're feeling. Sometimes they'll mix them up, that fear and anxiety and anger becomes really muddled. And the more confused they are, what happens is their body starts reacting. And they don't know what's going on. Amplified hormones are taking over, so everything's even bigger. And the more scared they become, the more the emotions become bigger, and their acting out becomes larger. And so that's what happens with normal kids as they're developing, and they don't know what's happening inside. If you take somebody who's experienced a trauma, there's even more separation. So they're having difficulty even more identifying what's happening inside just their body, their breath, their emotions, and it becomes really confusing. And so inability to recognize their emotions, there's no ability to self-regulate. Just think about, so pause for a moment and bring to mind the last time you felt angry. You might see somebody you're angry at, a situation, and as you're bringing that memory up, noticing how your body starts to respond. You may notice sensations, you may not. You might feel contraction. But as your body starts to change, notice how your mind starts to change potentially with it. And recognizing that this is in an adult who's aware of what's going on. And if you are a child or a teenager who has no clue, they're experiencing all these things simultaneously and putting in a place of fear, it becomes even bigger. And then taking a breath. And then letting it go. Kind of shake a little bit. I don't want to leave you with anger, so we're going to put in a happy moment. So bring to mind a happy moment. It just could be a moment, a person, a place that you're just, that's my happy place. And just notice if and how your body changes, your mind changes in response to that. Take another breath. And noticing the differences between the two is similar, like think about you're working with the youth and how emotionally they're all over the place and their emotions are changing. And how if your mind was different and thinking and processing in a happy memory versus an angry memory. And so that's all reflective of how our minds respond, if we're able to learn. And I bring that up is because if you're trying to work with a child who is in the state of dysregulation, trying to have a logical conversation with them is not going to be successful. And it's not their fault. Their brain, their physiology, and their chemicals, their neurochemicals, they're responding accordingly, right? But trying to have a conversation when they are a big ball of emotions is just not what it's at. So what I do want to talk about is...
Miss?
Yeah.
So is it right to redirect, so basically like, it's, yes, a kid needs their space, but how much time do you think is right? Because sometimes they're just gonna shut down and not be able to express themselves.
Right.
Or cry themselves, so it's better, let's give them space, but then say, okay, let me know when you're ready.
Mm-hmm. So what I have them do is I work with them, so they're doing it consciously. And so what I mean by consciously is that instead of going to avoidance and dismissing what's happening, is I actually go with like, what are you noticing? And when I ask what are you noticing, I stay with like the sensations, keeping it specific and not making a story around it. And if it's too much for them, I help them orient into the room. Like if they're really, really angry, and what I mean by orienting is to go with the sensations. Okay, I can feel the tablecloth underneath my hands. I can feel the textures on the wall. If you stick with what's in this room right now, it helps them to start to calm down. And they can't dissociate and they can't just go into avoidance because you're staying right with them. And then, okay, how long do you need? And you actually set, it's like a healthy boundary. How long would you like to take for yourself? And you actually set a time. 5 minutes, okay. Why don't you go for a walk for 5 minutes and we'll come back and talk. Yeah. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a great question because you don't want them to go into avoidance because then they're just going to perpetuate an unhealthy response to it.
Feel like, oh, like you don't care, you're not gonna ask me again.
Right. Yeah, no. And it's acknowledging where they're at and saying, I see that you're really emotional right now, which is okay. And I want to make sure that we can still talk about it, and as well as teaching them how, staying with them, teaching them how to orient into the room, teaching them how to take breaths, you're teaching them how to self-regulate. And so the times and the frequencies and the durations start to change and lessen because the more you do it with them of self-regulation, the more they'll be able to do it not in relation with you. Yeah, exactly. And that's what I'm going to talk on as well, is that 90% of trauma recovery is self-regulation. Is that teaching yourself, because you can't heal and you can't process when you're in like the hyperactive or the hypoactive states. And the more you can stay within this sweet spot, then you're okay. Like I can feel the sadness, but it's not overwhelming me. Cool. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. And I use the example of anxiety, and I love this image because it gives like a physical conception of what's really going on. Is that you might see outside, you might see anger, you might see lack of focus, that they're distracting all the time. You're trying to talk to them and they're looking away, or you're in a classroom and they're constantly looking out the window. You're playing basketball and they're having their own little, their own party in the corner. You might see avoidance. We're talking about the truancy and not showing up. The overplanning. This one's important and is also connected to like the people pleaser. Their self-coping is actually constantly organizing, constantly being on top of things. They've got a really super organized, color-coded binder, and they know what's going on and who is doing what with whom. That's their way of tracking the school and tracking people. That's the way of coping inside. So you might see this while all of this is going on underneath. It might be embarrassment, it might be helplessness, it might be hurt, it might be pain, it might be isolation, it might be sadness. You have the tip of the iceberg gives us what's actually happening underneath. So, okay. And the last piece I wanted to touch on as far as just defining trauma is I want to touch on the vicarious trauma. As I mentioned, is that you have a child who's growing up in a household with witnessing domestic violence, and so having no sense of safety at home, that there's constantly something fighting, arguing, whatever's happening, so they're constantly like hypervigilant. They're what is okay, what is not okay, they're never actually safe, they can't take a breath. And so what that does is that internalizes to them, the world's not safe. I'm not safe, people aren't safe, and so I constantly need to be on guard. And they might be listening to the news. Everything, unfortunately, with the internet is instantly out there and amplified. And so listening to these stories, again, the youth are feeling like the world is not a safe place to be in. And so this creates this internalized trauma, even if it did not directly happen to them. And I wanted to mention, because we all work with youth, we wouldn't be in this room if we don't do what we do. Just listening to them and taking in their stories and really wanting to help, and it comes from a genuine place, we start to take in unconsciously their state of being. And so one of the things in the first place to really, like, how do we help the youth is making sure that we are in healthy places. Whether it's figuring out what our self-care is. Some people love to go to the gym, others like to go hiking, bowling, whatever activities might be, just like a healthy outlet that is disconnected and just like, again, happy place is really important. The other thing that I was talking about before we started the workshop is like making sure you really have a healthy system. We, I believe, we are here because we really want to help the youth. We cannot do it on our own. We need to make sure that we have partnerships and we have supporters and everybody in collaboration around us, that we're all doing it together. And it's not just for the kids that we help, it's for us as well. That's how we become stronger to really, really support the next generation. So, as I transition into what we can do and how we can help them, I wanted to name the 3 keys of trauma. When you're talking about somebody in an emotional state, the best 3 things that we can do for them is that they need to be able to experience or express what they're experiencing. If they are telling something to you, just listen to them and acknowledge, I believe that you're experiencing this. And even active listening is that I can see that you're sad. I can see that you're frustrated. Because having that recognized, because kids with trauma and that have grown up more times than not, especially if it's either at home or it's in their communities or it's at school, especially like with bullying, they've been told over and over again that you made that up. That's not real. And so what that does to them is it makes them break. They have to compartmentalize and become something else. And so their sense of what is real, and then they start to identify with oh, my emotions might not be real. What I feel might not be real, is because they constantly been experiencing that from outside. So just acknowledging that I believe you, I can feel the sadness and the frustration, can be more powerful and profound than you realize. And then the other thing is allowing them to feel their feelings. Is allowing them to really just emote, whatever that might be. If they're feeling anger or sadness or frustration or confusion, and not to dismiss it, but saying it's okay. I'm gonna sit with you while you feel those emotions and it's completely okay. And then these other ones, what I wanted to touch on, I've touched on the lack of awareness. But the other thing that I think is really important for us to realize is that it is non-linear. There is no start here, start at step 1 and move through step 5 and we're good to go and we're gonna be beautifully. And it doesn't move progressively, step 1, step 2, progressively getting better. It's more, instead of a nice beautiful line. It's more all over the place. There's backsliding. There are other days that you might see the kid and they're doing great and they're happy and they're confident and they're strong. And then next moment, the next day, there's a huge explosion. And there does not need to be any rhyme or reason. It's that it could be unconscious emotions got triggered. It could be a memory has popped up that they repressed. And all we can do is sit there. And I believe you. And and sit there with them, and I will sit here with you in the darkness. And then the other one, which I named as well, is the self-regulation. Is the more we use the tools of teaching them how to regulate, to teaching them how to work with their emotions in healthy ways. I'm an athlete, so we'll talk about sports and how they can use that to help regulate and express themselves in different ways. And so the second half of the workshop together is talking about what we can do. And instead of giving you a ton of different tools and things you can implement, what I really would like to focus on is creating a safe community, and as well as the second part is awareness and self-regulation. Because instead of implementing a bunch of tools and different things we can be doing with them, first and foremost is we're getting them onto land. We're getting them onto the beach. Any questions on the first half or anything coming up? Okay. So take a nice breath. Stretch and move if you need to. There you go. So, what we can do, and I intentionally use the word we because we are community and we are in it together. How do we help the kids is really in partnership with each other. There are 3 tiers that you can look at. I'm going to focus on just this one down here, but I just wanted to give like a sense in the lay of the land and how you can structure this at the different settings that you're working with. This tier 1 is creating a safe environment. To me, that's 1, right? All these other ones, they're important, but if you don't have the safe environment, then your house is going to crumble. But looking at the safe environment as well as how we can create that from the policies to the classes to the details down, which I'm going to talk about further, is really where it all starts. The second one is early intervention. So if you have a safe environment and you have the safe space and you have a healthy community that's communicating and that's consistent, you'll be able to really see the students who need additional support, right? If the group and the classroom and the environment isn't enough, like, oh, this person needs this and more support. And so that's what brings you up here, is identifying the students who need that one-on-one time. They need to check in with the teacher, like maybe doing regular check-ins with their teacher or their coach or the facilitator, whoever's working. And then if that is not enough, then you see, oh, okay, these couple students, they need a little bit more support on top of that. And so that's this third tier, which is more intensive. You're looking at therapists, you're looking at making sure they have the right, the training and the facilitation to really help the student through whatever the traumas are that are underneath it. So, trauma-informed community and trauma-informed care. My bias is that we all should be trauma-informed, for not just the youth, but ourselves. Consistency, stability, and clear expectations is key. And what I mean by that is that if you have a child who is dysregulating emotionally all the time, it's because they've constantly been in environments where they're not safe, they're constantly hypervigilant, they're second-guessing themselves. So if you can create a community center that is that stability, then you're teaching them, you're giving them a place where they can land, right? And as well as you're teaching them their nervous system, how they actually can calm down, even if it's for an afternoon, even if it's for a couple times during the week, you're giving that to them. And what I mean by consistency is that you have your whole staff, you have everybody on board trained to practice similarly. And consistently, I think it's another slide, but consistency could be as simple as having a community calendar, right? You have on Mondays, every Monday you have this. And there's communication like this is the classes, the after school program that we're gonna do on Mondays. Tuesdays we're doing basketball. And the more you're consistent and you have, it's like almost like a metronome, right? It's like really rhythmic and they know what to expect and there's no surprises, so they know exactly what they're stepping into. And it's just similar to what goes with communication. The more you communicate to not just the youth but to the families, then you get the next system on board is actually the family systems as well. Okay. And then I do want to talk about, so I talked about the families, but I do want to talk about the after school programs as well as the sports, because I mentioned that, so I'm a boxer, and the one thing that's been really great, because I know some of the PALs have boxing programs, has been a really great resource and tools to work with the youth with trauma. Because you have a safe space, you have a way and a place for them to actually externalize their emotions. And so and then you're also teaching them how to regulate. Because for those who don't know boxing, you have them go and they're working on the bag and all their emotions are going into the bag. And then you have them pause after a round for like a minute. You have them take a breath. You're teaching them how to regulate. Because then you're going back into, you're expressing their emotions over and over again, and then you take a pause, taking a breath. You're teaching them how to regulate. And so all these things with using breath work, using things that actually are what they enjoy, whether it be basketball or, I'm in sports land, whether it be basketball, whatever it is, everything where you can actually ingrain the self-regulation, then they're not just learning it in just one classroom in just one way. Now they're learning it in basketball. Now they're learning it in after-school study hall. And so the more they actually get the similar language and the similar practices, it becomes natural to them. And then we've seen kids, they learn the language so well that they realize their anger starts to come up and they are able to express, I'm feeling angry right now, I need to go for a walk and I'll be back in 2 minutes. Because they're learning what's actually going on. The last thing I do want to mention on this slide as well is the community inclusion. Is that we've been working with the youth, we've been working with making sure we can create the safe container for them, and now we start reaching out and including their families. We start to educate their parents as well and their siblings, as well as any other community volunteers that want to be part of our organization, and we're continuing to build this tribe, right? And so the more they have it, not just at the PAL centers, and they're getting it home now. And they're getting it at some of the schools that we're working with, and even some of the other community areas that we go in, it becomes more consistent. And so when they do have emotional outbursts, when they do have something that comes up, they've learned their tools so much, they're able to actually practice it in other areas. And going further into creating a safe environment. Meet them where they are. Remember when I started off with that metaphor, is that if you have a student who is drowning in the ocean and they're just trying to stay surviving, that is not the place where you want to teach them about identifying their emotions. You want to get them on land. You want to use the skills of either orienting them into the room with using the senses. You want to help them, teach them how to self-regulate with using breath. They might need to go for a run. There was one student that we were working with who couldn't understand what was going on. She was attention seeking, but then getting really aggressive in the group. And after a while, we identified what she needed. She would get really anxious. And she didn't know what to do with the energy until she realized that she needed to run. And so she would say, I need to go for a run. So 2 minutes, she would go and run outside on the track, come back in and sit down, and she was fine. It's not like beautifully magic happened, but it's a lot of communication, like what do you need? I don't know, let's explore. Let's play with it. Until we found the right system that worked for her, and it helps not only her, but the class, instead of it being disrupted all the time.
I like that idea, because just to release the energy, but do you guys ever recommend like pills, anything like that? I mean, I'm anti-pills, but also there's other solutions.
Right. So pills is out of my scope. I am not adverse to it because sometimes there are neurochemical things that are going on that I'm supportive of. I am an advocate of, if that's happening, to also have complementary, like mindfulness and self-regulation in tandem with it, so it's not just pill dependent. But it's really like I said, like working with as a team. Part of that is working with doctors, because that's their expertise and that's their specialization. I try to find ones who are more holistic, and so they aren't just the pill will be the solution, that we're all in communication and working together. Because sometimes, especially as the child's developing, that there is something that they need help rebalancing in their system physiologically before some of them can be weaned off of it.
Yeah, I feel like the parents nowadays, they feel like that is the solution, which is not good because they're not educated.
Right. Because then it just completely goes to like a blind eye, like, okay, take the pill and that's it. And
allowing them to express themselves in other ways, even more things to do.
Yeah. Because there are pros and cons to it, because sometimes some of the medication actually disconnects them more from their sensations and their emotions and what's going on. Like there is sometimes a benefit because it needs to be kind of like muted a little bit, or at least turn the volume down. And then once they can start identifying and they can start learning it, okay, then we can start playing with reducing the medication and working with the emotions differently. It's a dance, and there is no like non-linear. it's the more you can work with like a transparent team, the better it really is. And sometimes it depends on the kids as well, making them part of the conversation as well as like what are you experiencing and what's going on is like all information that helps them, because they also feel like things aren't being done to them. They're part of what's really happening. Yeah. And it comes back to like making sure that they have a voice in what's going on. Yeah, and there might be times when they don't like it, but it is the best route, and acknowledging like, I understand you don't like the side effects or what's happening with this, and do you understand why we're doing these things for your best development, and make sure you're healthy and before we can change it again. Yeah. So meeting them where they are, and then I mentioned this one as well as active listening. Is that when you're working with them and they're coming to you with problems and you're reflecting it back, it could be as just reflecting what you heard. So I heard that Joey took the ball and that you're really frustrated because he didn't ask for permission and you don't know what to do. And so reflecting it back and naming it back to them, it's another magical moment of actually having them recognize, like, I hear you, and this is what I heard. Sometimes they actually hear and they realize, yeah, I was frustrated. Yeah, I didn't know what to do. And so it helps in the dialogue as well. This one I love doing, is creating community agreements as a group. So if you're working with either a sports team or an after-school program, that you actually together as like the facilitator or the director and the class together, you create your classroom agreements. You create what you actually need, because you give them an opportunity to say what they need to learn, to feel safe, as well as you can speak as the facilitator or the teacher of what you need in order to be able to teach, or to keep them feeling safe as well. And once you make an agreement together, what happens is this is healthy accountability. Is that one thing I was listening to when Ray was in the opening statements, is that you don't just dismiss their behaviors, they're held accountable. So if they break their agreements or break one of the agreements you came together as a group, you can acknowledge their behavior was not okay. It has nothing to do with them as a person. There's no shaming. There's no looking down at them. But what you did is not okay for the safety of the group. And so here's your consequences. So that's a both and way, where you hold them accountable and you still hold them with compassion, right? Consistency I mentioned, and this other one is cultivating curiosity. As you notice the way I worked through the workshop, when I've had you take a breath and just being curious about what's happening, curious about sensations or thoughts, is the more you become curious about it without there's a right and wrong, there's no black and white, then that actually opens them up to like, oh, I have a choice to make. Like what is that? What is that sensation? What am I thinking? it starts to develop their own way of self-reflection without being afraid of giving the wrong answer. Because there is no wrong answer, right? And the other thing I like to do when I'm working with kids is like, if I'm asking, they're talking about they're feeling anxious, I'm like, what does anxiety feel like to you? How do you experience it? Because it might be different for me, and I want to know what you're feeling. And so the more I can talk in those languages, it helps them to like, oh, there is no right or wrong, and they become more open, and they become more curious, and they're able to freely speak of what's happening. And the last thing I had down here, as far as what helps really build community, is you can either do it individually one-on-one, or you can do it in a group, or just a roundtable check-in. And similar to like, we've been cultivating like the curiosity, is just having a round table and a circle of checking in, like, what are you noticing right now? And just having each kid be able to share, no advice giving, no there's right or wrong, no processing, just let them be able to express what they're experiencing right now, and have everybody witness that is really just helpful for the kids. It helps everybody connect more, and to realize like, oh, Joe has been really angry, but this is what's going on at home. And so now I understand what's actually happening. And this slide I wanted to just touch on briefly, but not go deeply into, is social emotional learning. A lot of it are the concepts that we've been talking about and touching on, is that the more you develop self-awareness, your emotions, and your thoughts, the more the kids are able to actually start to manage their emotions. And their actions and their words aren't acting out from that place. What that starts to impact is their interpersonal skills with the other kids, with the adults, with the parents. But to me, the very foundation, you can't really go on to the other complexities of relationships with others if you don't build that own awareness of yourself. Any questions on it? Yes.
I actually have a question about your the graphic image up on this slide.
Yeah.
I kind of like to live on Castle's website. I love to learn all about it, and I haven't seen that graphic, and I really love it. Did you make that yourself?
I did not. I took it from their website. I did. I love it because like what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, it so clearly helps. Like here is basically you're working with the youth. This is all to do with yourself, right? And to me, if you start learning this first, your own self-awareness, how your body responds to, and that's when I'm talking about like curiosity, how my body responds to fear is different from another child. And the more I can identify myself, then I can be able to like, oh, I'm noticing that fear coming up. And working with the youth, the more they're able to understand how they respond to certain situations, we learn the tools that they need to be able to manage when it starts to come up, right?
Right.
And then that directly connects to actually connecting with others.
Yeah.
And relating. And then the nice over that.
That's like the key right there. You know, and it's so funny because I've read and studied so much about this, and obviously responsible decision making, but I never made that connection how the intersection is what leads to that, and it's so beautiful. Did you get this recently off their site?
It's been within the last like 3 months or so.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's probably about how long expenses have been on.
Yeah, it was either off of their website or one of their publication articles that they released, but it was, yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
That's great, thank you, Monica.
You're welcome. Any questions? Any questions or comments or any other? I hope it was not too much information. I've been a participant in the recipient end, where it's just like an overwatch. My intention was to start the conversation, as to at least to start to take pieces that you can start to see how you can work it into your programs and your youth that you're working with, that are realistic. Any questions?
I actually have a question.
Yes.
What is your, what's your, I guess, not opinion, or maybe advice I'm asking? So when you're talking about how some people just completely shut down and withdraw, and they're either not willing to talk about what they're feeling, or they don't understand what they're feeling, they don't really deal with the emotions that come with to, it says, did I get that right?
Yeah.
And then the young lady would shake her head yes or no or whatever. What is your thoughts on that? Is that a viable or advisable practice, or is that not good because maybe that person is really not sharing properly how the other child is feeling?
Right. First and foremost, I would say yes, because
Okay.
that is meeting the child where they're at.
Okay.
And what I would pay attention to is if it started to err on, it became too much, that they are becoming too dependent on their friends, like in a healthy way.
Right.
But I would also look at, like, this is where they are.
Right.
And it might be where they are for weeks, it might be months or even a year
Okay.
plus. And because I look at, especially like oppositional defiant students that I've worked with at another program, is that you sit there with them. Like, I see that you're frustrated and you don't want to talk with me, and I'm going to sit here with you, and it's okay. And the more you make friends with, that's their way of being like, that's okay. Like, how can we create something that supports you and we can still stay in connection? And it sounds like with her, it's through the liaison of their friend. That's where it is. And I would just continue to reevaluate it to make sure it's a healthy relationship for everybody there.
Okay.
Yeah, because I wouldn't want my hesitation would be, are they too reliant and that is their only form of communication, their only way of connecting, that stays too long.
I see.
But then I would look for other symptoms, like, are they regressing, are they having like seem depressed, or they're isolating more? When I see that, I would just pay attention to the cues.
Okay.
Yeah, does that answer the question? Or help?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Any other questions? My last slide, is that other things? Is just thank you. I thank you, and like I said, is like we're all here, I'm here because it's to help the next generation of kids that are in our community. And each one of you is here because of that. So I thank you for doing the work that you guys do. That's all. Thank you, everybody. If one thing, if you are interested in having the slides, email that to you. I can take your email and information, as well as if you'd like any other information because Live Like This, we work directly with the youth and the adults, as well as some of the centers for trainings. If you'd like us to send any more information on how you can implement that into your programs, I'd be more than happy to take your information so I can make sure you have the resources that you need. The educator in me is like, I want to make sure you guys have the resources to teach the kids. So, but thank you, everybody.